Good evening. Welcome to Windows on the World. And this is our Monday show. Last week we did it on a Tuesday, and the real time for it is a Monday. Now, it used to be a Sunday, but if there's any changes to that, I will actually post them on YouTube and in our Discord server. So do join our Discord server if you enjoy this type of information and if you like sharing information. Last week's show was called Sabbatian Frankists, the Mary cult and the Catholic Church. We talked about the infiltration of the Catholic Church by the Sabbatian Frankists, both Sabbatai Zevi, who actually converted to Islam, and Jacob Frank, who was the reincarnation of Sabbatai Zevi, according to him. And these false messiahs have a long track record of going nowhere and causing a lot of trouble. So really what we're talking about is a follow-up to that last week's show. Tonight's show is called Frank's Freemasonry and Kabbalah. So we're going to follow up with the information that we started putting out last week and expand on it into how the Kabbalah influenced Freemasonry through Sabbatian Frankism. Redemption through sin. Order out of chaos. Can you see the similarity? I was looking at a website today, a Freemasonic website, and the first thing it says at the top is order from chaos. So a lot of this stuff is energy harvesting, wasting time in useless and pointless ritual, going round in circles, being directed by a group of people to keep you on a hamster wheel, which leads you spiritually nowhere. That is the most positive side of this type of cult behavior. The worst side of it, of course, is a lot different, believing that egomaniacs are the Messiah. We can even see that on YouTube, can't we? We can see it in movements that we are directed into. So yes, people who are sociopathic and psychopathic do get noticed, and people do take notice of them. And this manipulation has been going on for thousands of years, and there doesn't seem to be much of an end to it in sight, because people still fall for flat out liars as long as they tell a good story. And the Kabbalistic history is full of these type of characters, self-proclaimed messiahs, degenerates and mentally unstable people. Creepy, demonic, annoying, and at times comedic. That's the tagline, maybe. I wrote that before it started. Creepy, demonic, annoying, and at times comedic. So last week we talked about the Nisterim, which is this group of 36 elders who may well have started the Scottish Rite of Freemasonry. And I thought I would actually put that into an internet search this evening to see what came up under the new artificial intelligence, non-intelligence, Internet 2, which is what we're under at the moment. It says the relationship between Nisterim, Kabbalah, and the Scottish Rite of Freemasonry is complex and multifaceted. This is obviously a release from Freemasonic sources. It says, while there are connections between Kabbalah and Freemasonry, the term Nisterim specifically refers to a secret or hidden teaching, and the relationship between that term and the Scottish Rite is, wait for it, not explicitly established in mainstream Masonic literature. Well, it wouldn't be, would it? It would be publicly denied. But in this case, they're not even denying it. They're just saying, well, there may be a tenuous connection, but we're not going to talk about it. So remember what they say about Freemasonry, what they say about themselves. We're not a secret society, but we're a society with secrets. Now I'm going to quote to you from the Grand Lodge of British Columbia and Yukon. And this is what they say about Kabbalah and Freemasonry. The Kabbalah is an essentially Jewish mystical or esoteric school, although the Christian church fathers of the first century were demonstrably Kabbalists. Now that is an absolute flat out lie. That is a bald-faced lie to cover up the fact that the Freemasons were taken over by Kabbalists. And we're going to go into that tonight. The difference between the York Rite and the Scottish Rite. a flat out lie, as Kabbalah started in the Languedoc in the 1200s, was exported to Spain and came into Britain through the so-called Enlightenment, which in actual fact would have been better if it never happened, in my opinion, because we had people like Thomas Paine, of course, who was the promoted puppet in putting forward this new vision, which created this social engineering group called the British, who then went on from being nationalists to being internationalists and now to being globalists. So the whole thing's degenerate from beginning to end, and we're not at the end yet. So yes, there is no evidence for that. It's very telling that it started in the 1200s, and they're saying it started with the first fathers of Christianity in the first few hundred years. Flat out lie. There on the Freemasonic website I've just been quoting from. The subversion of minds into fake mystery. It has hooked millions. And initiates and useful idiots are also, of course, necessary to carry on what they call the great work. Hasn't been so great so far, has it? Order out of chaos describes the system which became Sabbatian Frankism. Create as much turmoil and degeneracy on the earth so the Messiah returns and sorts it out. What sort of minds believe this nonsense? Well, the sort of minds that actually created the Scottish Rite of Freemasonry and the Illuminati lodges in France, which were actually very instrumental in the development of the new Scottish Rite of Freemasonry. Of course, the Illuminati lodges of France were directly involved in the French Revolution through groups such as the Martinists. And we also have from this period the Ellis Cohen, the elected priesthood of the universe. Look at a video we did and also an article at windowsontheworld.net called A Cult That Rules the World ? And another one that's just titled Elected Priesthood of the Universe. Yeah, they do not suffer from low esteem, these people, do they? So Freemasonry, it's not a useful managerial system. It's good for control, but it's a mix-up of false belief, and with this Kabbalistic influence into the Scottish Rite, it produced self-proclaimed messianic egomaniacs who were mentally unstable. And of course, we're talking about Sabbatai Zevi, later Jacob Frank. The idea is to usher in an era of stability, peace, and harmony. Of course, we had Freemasonic authors such as Albert Pike talking about this, but that's the stuff they just talk about in public. And when we look into this and we start going into the Kabbalistic and underground connections, then they are not really hidden, which is fascinating to me because I love stuff that is just under the surface. And that is the great thing about this. You can find it out very quickly and very easily if you know what you're looking for. You have to have references. If you don't have the references, you can't find anything. That's the trick. So yes, Kabbalistic Freemasonry came out of all this, and they were influenced in the first instance by people like Isaac Luria, a Kabbalistic teacher, and he was an influence on the later self-proclaimed messiahs. After his pupil had described Luria as the Messiah, other people started calling Isaac Luria the Messiah, and he had a small Kabbalistic school. Never actually wrote that much down, but he called it the Lurian Kabbalah, and it was written actually, I think, after his death by his pupils, if I remember correctly. We also had a few other self-proclaimed messiahs in the Kabbalistic fraternity. David Alroy of Iraq inspired Caucasian mountain Jews to attack Persia in the 12th century. See, it's all about order out of chaos. In 1290, Abraham Abulafia proclaimed a new dawn in Sicily using a Kabbalistic technique called, I wonder where he got this from, the way of the divine name. Well, the way, he nicked that, obviously. The divine name would be all about the names that are in the Kabbalah, in the tree of life, the 10 Sephiroth, which you have to go through to reach the highest point, which you're allowed to reach within their system. It's all a bunch of waffle. I've read loads of it. Will lead you nowhere. And of course, we had Nathan of Gaza, who proclaimed Sabbatai Zevi the Messiah, despite Sabbatai Zevi having converted to Islam. And then, of course, we had the Don May, who were referred to as the wife-swapping Jews, crypto-Jews of Thessaloniki, or Salonika as it was then. Got to remember that these people weren't Jews. They were Sabbatian Frankists, or in the time of Zevi, Sabbatians. And they were kicked out of pretty much everywhere. Go to last week's show, the last one in the archive, and you can hear much more about that. But we're going to move on tonight into the Freemasonic influence of all this. So in turn, Nathan of Gaza had been influenced by Abraham Abulafia. So it's a little cabal of self-promoting know-it-alls who devised this system. They all influenced Templar Freemasonry. Templar Freemasonry really got a hold during the 17 to 1800s. And of course, in turn, the Scottish Rite. Now, how can this happen when those who are jumping on this bandwagon and infiltrating Freemasonry are complete lunatics? Well, quite easily, it seems. The system of Kabbalah is about finding your way through a prescribed route of paths which lead you nowhere, a little like Freemasonry. A little knowledge is given which is completely pointless. And it's quite funny, actually, because I used to go to a club in London and the hall downstairs was hired out by Freemasons, and they used to come into the bar after their meetings. And one of the Freemasons actually left his initiation book on the bar, and his name was Roger Tippeler. Quite ironic that. I loved that, Roger Tippeler. He got so drunk, he left his initiation book on the bar in this club I went to. So I took it home with me, and if he ever needs it, I've still got it somewhere. But I just wanted to tell everyone out there there's nothing in it. It's a complete load of garbage, all about recreating the mythical Solomon's Temple and behaving yourself. And it's based on ancient Egyptian control system, which is pharaonic. And of course, the pharaohs were just poster boys for the Vratsis, the people who were behind them, the people who were really in charge, made them go through stupid rituals. They made them go through death rituals so that they would pass through an underworld into the place that they needed to be. And they could take everything with them, of course, because they didn't know that there was a spiritual life. It was all about materialism. So you could take all your old furniture into the afterlife as well, as has been exposed with the excavation of the tombs in Valley of the Kings, etc. So the pharaohs weren't advanced at all. They're pretty backward. And the whole of the Egyptian cult, which influenced these other cults, is merely a way of control. So there's ritual and there is revelation. And if you have revelation, you don't need ritual. Quite simple. And of course, that goes into the Talmud and into Kabbalah and this obsession, this neurotic obsession, which we see in these cults. Yes, so do take a look at last week's show, Sabbatian Frankists, the Mary cult and the Catholic Church. And we're now going to get into Jacob Frank. And I did tell you last week that we would be looking at what Jacob Frank actually did. This is the sort of degenerate he was. We have to remember that Sabbatai Zevi, before him, he was proclaimed the Messiah by Nathan of Gaza, another Kabbalist, and proclaimed himself the Messiah in 1666. Used to push around a fish in a pram. He used to scream and shout at the top of his voice. He was banned from his hometown Smyrna and pretty much everywhere he went. And he died, or his tomb is in modern day Montenegro. But he was a wanderer, like many of these people. So yeah, Jacob Frank was also a wanderer, and he ended up wandering really in Poland, modern day Ukraine. And of course, modern day Ukraine will be, I think, the next Israel for certain people who believe in these cults. So Jacob Frank's subversion, yes, his whole family was Sabbatian. They were followers of Sabbatai Zevi. And there were numerous outbreaks of followers of Sabbatai Zevi, known as the Donme, in eastern Poland, which is now Ukraine, particularly in Podolia and Galicia between the late 17th and early 18th century to give you a little bit of exposition. Frank foresaw that Poland would be the place that would prepare for the coming universal transformation by the divine will of the earth in the coming messianic era of peace, led by him, of course. So modern day Ukraine is being prepared as per the followers of Sabbatian, Zevi and Jacob Frank, and of course the Kabbalists. And many of them are flocking there, have been for quite some time. We're going to get on to now the degeneracy of Jacob Frank. Remember, this is all a massive influence on Freemasonry. Frank's Messiah complex started with him, guess what? Having visions. Yes, it usually starts with them having visions, doesn't it? And he wrote it down as, no modesty attached here, the collection of the words of the Lord. In other words, him. No modesty on display. Refers to himself both in the first and the third person. Now, people who refer to themselves in the third person are usually monstrously and insufferably egotistical. I've known several in my life. They give themselves an alter ego and refer to themselves as that when they want something. And this is what Jacob Frank was like. So like Zevi, Sabbatian Zevi, Frank reports having visions or possibly just delusions. Frank reports on tricking people in his real life to take his place, and some of them got killed. Quite serious stuff. They get murdered in their beds, as they are where Jacob Frank was thought to be, but Frank had turned the tables on them. He imposes himself on many people throughout his writings and forces his opinions, falling out with many Jews whom he argues with incessantly. So he wasn't popular with the Jewish community at all. Okay, let's have a story. I, having come once to the synagogue in Salonika, where there were about 1,200 householders, shouted in a mighty voice, let nobody dare to come up on the pulpit, because I'll knock him down on the spot. What a stupid thing to say. In amazement, everyone began to shout, how is it that you prohibit us to do this? So, Jacob Frank says, shouting the same again, I grabbed the pulpit and cried out that I would murder the first one who dared come up. And then, having taken the scroll of the laws of Moses, I put them on the bare ground, and having lowered my pants, I sat on them with my bare behind, and all the Jews, being unable to do anything, had to leave. So can you imagine someone doing this in your place of worship? It's not the way to win friends and influence people, is it really? Greatly repulsed by these deeds, the Jewish women set an ambush for me one evening in a certain street, each one armed with a scarf full of stones. When I was passing, they began to shower me with a hail of rocks. I, saying nothing, picked up those very rocks and began to throw them back at them, the women. Some miscarried right away. Many fainted, many became wounded, groaning and screams spread all over the street, and I went quietly home. What a psychopath. So these women have thrown some stones at him, and he's basically stoned them so badly that they're really injured and they're lying all over the street, according to him. Having no idea what to do against me, the Jews hired some Turks to kill me in my own home. While sleeping one evening in my room, somehow I was taken by the desire to go lie down on the porch. So I told one Greek man who lived in the same inn that he should sleep in my place that day, and I would go out to sleep upon the porch. And so it happened. The Turks, knowing my room, the one in which I slept, ran in and killed the Greek, thinking that I lay there. So when you think about this, and then you think about the fact that he wrote it down and he's calling himself the Messiah when he's doing this, it only really points to one thing: demonic possession or insanity, doesn't it? And of course, there were many thousands, if not millions of people over these periods where Sabbatian Zevi and Jacob Frank were around who followed them. In fact, some researchers say at least half the Jews in the world followed these people who weren't Jews. They were converted to Islam in the case of Sabbatian Zevi, because the Sultan got so fed up with his behavior, he said, convert to Islam or we'll kill you. And Sabbatian Zevi, in his own mind, a legend in his own lunchtime, thought that the Sultan was elevating him to the status of a messiah. But Sabbatai Zevi ended up being the doorman for the Sultan, basically doing a bit of door work for the Sultan, the doorman work for the Sultan, like as a bouncer for the Sultan. And he still thinks that he's been elevated to this messianic status. It's quite funny in a way. So Frank then says, what do the Jews finally do? They persuade and bribe all the innkeepers in Salonika to kill me themselves, wherever I should come to stay overnight. I came to one such. This one was very worthy. He revealed to me the intent and the conspiracy of the Jews. A rabbi gives him some gold pieces, and then Frank states, I hired a horse from the wagoners who, according to custom, were traveling in 2 companies. The Jews bribed the Turks to kill me on the way. The Turks posted themselves on the road. My horse became lame as soon as I started out. I exchanged it then with my wagon master, and at the same time borrowed a blanket from him in which I wrapped myself and rode up to the front of the caravan. The Turks, thinking that I was on the lame horse in the back, as they had seen me at the beginning of the trip, killed the wagon master and took him to the Jews, who recognized the futility of their plot. This is very dark stuff. And when you think about it, even if this person did this, would you write it down and brag about it? Very strange and disturbing behavior from a messiah, isn't it? So influence now through Freemasonry and the Catholic churches supported by the Jesuits leads into the influence of the Kabbalah into Freemasonry. And that's where this show is going. But just to finish up, just like Sabbatai Zevi, Frank was unhinged and obviously an exhibitionist. Frank was, it seems, more psychopathic than Sabbatai Zevi, who may have been, in modern parlance, diagnosed with what is called bipolar disorder. So this is where we're going with this. I've just got to find my place here. Yes. So yes, from the Languedoc in the 1200s to the Kabbalah of the Rosicrucians and the Scottish Rite is where this show is going to be going from now on. This is from the Square magazine, a Freemasonic magazine. I looked it up today because there is a document which we've read out before, and it's called the Regius Manuscript of 1390 that states, in the time of good King Athelstan, which was in the 900s, early 900s, Freemasonry was alive in Britain through King Athelstan. So here we have what may have been the original Freemasonry before the Kabbalists took it over, because this was a form of Scandinavian, maybe mixed with Anglo-Saxon type Freemasonry, if that's the right word for it, because this may have just been some kind of brotherhood. However, it says there are 3 documents from the Middle Ages that have long puzzled Freemasons in the British Isles. One is called the Halliwell Poem, the second is called the Cook Manuscript, and the third is called the Dowland Manuscript. So we're going to look at particularly the Cook Manuscript. Fragments of the traditional law of the Jewish guilds were preserved by Christian Masons, and that's revealed in a surviving English document of operative Freemasonry. The Cook Manuscript, believed to have been from around 1400, in which the scribe drew on the Sefer Yetzirah, this is one of the Kabbalistic works, and the extra biblical Jewish sources when he described the origins and development of the craft. So here we have a statement which is extremely interesting, because if we're going back to the 1400s, it would have tied in directly with Kabbalism in the Languedoc of the 12th and 1300s going into the 1400s, when the Kabbalah would have been incorporated into what was early Freemasonry. So it's directly linking the Kabbalists of the Languedoc to Masonry and the later Scottish Rite of Freemasonry. So according to this other manuscript, the Regius Manuscript, Freemasonry was in England in the time of good King Athelstan. He was King of England in the first half of the 900s, long before the Templars or the cathedral stonemasons with their building lodges came to England. This is from a Freemasonic website. So if we talk about the 900s, this is officially before Freemasonry. Yet good King Athelstan is stating that Freemasonry was already in England and Britain. Athelstan became king of the Anglo-Saxons in 924 and king of the English from 927. King Athelstan altered the Norse initiation rites into Freemasonry as we know it today. That's fascinating, isn't it? Because I was looking at some websites earlier, and we have those initiations of Freemasonry, the rolling up of the trouser leg, the noose around the neck, which was incorporated into the Kabbalistic Judaic system of Freemasonry. So here we have something really fascinating, that this cult may have been in Britain way before the Kabbalists influenced it. Very important that. The Halliwell poem we're going to get onto next is an English script from, again, 1390. And it says, King Athelstan, in the year 926, convened an assembly in the city of York, quote, which revived the craft and gave it new laws. Interesting. So the Norse laws and the symbols were incorporated into this new craft. So we see that Freemasonry is changing in the 900s. King Athelstan was the grandson of King Alfred the Great. And there's many ways that you can spell Athelstan. Won't go into those, including Athelstone, actually. Aldiston, Adelston, that's familiar. Known for his success in securing the submission of Constantine II, the King of the Scots, at the Treaty of Eamont Bridge in 927 AD. So first, he went into Scotland, then to England. It says, and all through to the Battle of Brunanburh in 937 AD, this led to his claiming the title of the King of all Britain. Now, this is very interesting because I've looked into certain families which come through Scandinavia into Scotland. And one of those families is quite well known for having a gate at Kensington Palace called Ormgate. They were known as the Orm priests. Some became drovers. They went to Ireland, and many of them settled around Manchester, but they came through Scotland, and they were on the Scottish Isles. Very interesting, this, because it ties in to this period where we do not have a great deal of information because it's called Ancient Britain. So Athelstan was the first king of a unified England from 927 AD. He reigned from 925 to 939. So according to Masons, particularly those of the York Rite, Athelstan holds an endearing place in our history as a great supporter of Masonry in England, establishing charges and articles given to the craft to live by. So, good King Athelstan brought Freemasonry to Britain. So now we're going to go into the two branches of Freemasonry in Britain. The York Rite, which is now known also as the American Rite, is one of, it says on this Freemasonic website, the appendant bodies of Freemasonry, comprising three primary branches: the Royal Arch Masonry, the Cryptic Masonry, and the Chivalric Orders. It traces its origins to medieval England, with its name derived from the city of York, or, as Commons Beaumont would say, Babylon, where traditional Masonic legends suggest a Grand Lodge existed in ancient times. Isn't that interesting? Again, tying into the work of William Commons Beaumont and the importance of York as a centre of Britain. So They talk of the Royal Arch Masonry. This branch focuses on the search for lost secrets. So here we go. Here's the hamster wheel of going nowhere for the rest of your life, and the recovery of the legendary, wait for it, lost word of a master mason. Well, they meant to give you that when you join, because they have it on a ring, don't they? Oh, I've read all about this stuff. It's so tedious. Yakim and Boaz, Pillars of Hercules, all this stuff, mixed with a load of Egyptian crap. Yeah, it's pretty boring, to be honest. Cryptic Masonry. Oh, it's even worse, isn't it? Delving deeper into symbolic teachings, Cryptic Masonry explores the hidden meanings behind Masonic symbols and allegories. Oh, that really is the road to absolutely nowhere. I suppose it works for social climbers, though, because they get something out of it in the end. But of course, they sacrifice their souls to the Brotherhood. It includes, it says, the degrees of Royal Master and Select Master, which continue the narrative from the Royal Arch Masonry. So that is the York Rite. So it says degrees within this branch include the Order of the Red Cross and the Order of Malta and the Order of the Temple. So it says symbolism and themes. The York Rite incorporates rich symbolism drawn from biblical narratives, particularly focusing on the construction and symbolism of Solomon's temple. Yes, the allegorical building of the temple as you ascending as you go through every layer of this knowledge of how the temple is built. But you don't really need all that. However, it says its degrees are steeped in, wait for it, you're never going to guess, allegorical teachings emphasizing moral lessons, or basically mind control. Spiritual growth, well, that's just filling your head with a load of garbage. And the search for wisdom and truth, well, that's probably getting pissed up every 3 or 4 weeks with all the rest of the lodge. I used to see these people, and the state they got into was not spiritual whatsoever. You're talking about people who were very heavy drinkers when they had their lodge meetings. This club I used to go to was just down the road from Grand Lodge, Great Queen Street. It's near Holborn. And the state of these people, they would come into the bar and it would just ruin the atmosphere. Everything about them was wrong. So it basically a never-ending quest for nothing. The York Rite structure provides a cohesive journey for Masons seeking further enlightenment and understanding within the framework of traditional Masonic teachings, it says. So now we get on to the Scottish Rite. The Scottish Rite is a branch of Freemasonry that emerged in the 18th century, likely originating in France. Now we know the background of it, and we know the background of some of what happened in Scotland. This starts to make sense that it's a completely Kabbalistic order. And also another thing that's very important is that Scotland has always had a massive Hebrew connection. We'll look at the Treaty of Arbroath, for instance. But also, I've been reading today about the influence of the Kabbalists in Scotland way before this. And of course, in the last show, we talked of Adam Wilson of the Adamites, and we talked of the Jacobites, and we talked about these cults which were very influenced by the likes of Sabbatian and Jacob Frank. Okay, what is the Scottish Rite according to them? The Scottish Rite is a branch of Freemasonry that emerged in the 18th century, likely originating in France. Yes, that's where the Illuminati lodges were. They were responsible for the French Revolution, of course. And if you want to read all about that, or read about the cover story side of it, look at a book called Fire in the Minds of Men by James Billington. And it gives you massive detail of the history of what became known as the French Revolution. And if you want the role of Freemasonry in that, you need to go a bit deeper. But that will give you the names to look up. Then you can look at the lodges which they were connected to. So the Scottish Rite name is derived from the alleged connection to Scotland, though its development occurred primarily in France and later expanded to other countries. I would suggest that Freemasonry and this group and the Nisterim were probably already in Scotland by this time. The right structure was formalized in the 18th century, and it gained significant popularity in the 19th and 20th centuries. Well, I would say from the French Illuminati lodges involved in the French Revolution, such as the Martinists, very, very connected to the Scottish Rite. The Scottish Rite, above the York Rite, is the Illuminati Kabbalistic system of Freemasonry. The York Rite is very insignificant in comparison to the Scottish Rite as far as influence goes. Some of the bodies include the Lodge of Perfection, the Council of Princes of Jerusalem, Chapter of the Rose Cross, and Consistory. So they have a Rose Cross degree, a Rose Croix in French, Rose Croix degree coming from the French. And of course, the Order of the Rose Croix, also known as the Ellis Cohen or the Elected Priesthood of the Universe, are connected to the Rosicrucians, another Kabbalistic group. And their story of Father RC, as we said in last week's show, is Kabbalistic. So are their documents, the Farmer Fraternitatis, the Confessio, and Johann Valentinus and his alchemical wedding, purely Kabbalistic. So, yes, we can talk about the Ellis Cohen and the Order of the Rose Croix. And then they talk of their 33rd degree. The highest degree within the Scottish Rite, the 33rd degree, is an honorary degree bestowed upon members who have demonstrated exceptional dedication, or I would say obedience, to the service of Freemasonry. In other words, if you're a really useful idiot, they'll give you one of those. Philosophy and symbolism. Let's see what it says. The Scottish Rite places a strong emphasis on philosophical inquiry, moral teachings, and symbolic interpretations. Its degrees explore a wide range of subjects, including ethics, history, religion, and metaphysics. Symbolism plays a significant role, with each degree conveying, wait for it, you know what's coming next, don't you? Allegorical lessons and spiritual insights. The Rite's teachings incorporate elements of comparative religion, there you go, anything but Christianity, mysticism, Kabbalah, and esotericism, Kabbalah again, encouraging members to seek deeper understanding and personal enlightenment. Main differences between the York and the Scottish Rite. York Rite traces its roots to medieval England, with traditions linked to the city of York, or Babylon. Two branches, so one Scandinavian, Anglo-Saxon, one Kabbalistic. From the Enlightenment, the stooges of the Enlightenment adopted this Kabbalistic branch of thinking. For the Scottish Rite, they say, emerged in the 18th century, the York Rite focuses on Christian themes and symbolism, with narratives centered around biblical legends and the construction of Solomon's Temple, or the allegorical construction of Solomon's Temple, which is Kabbalistic, which is going through the 10 Sephiroth, basically. So I think the Kabbalah influences both of these, but the real esoteric stuff and the real subversive stuff is in the Scottish Rite. The Scottish Rite emphasizes, it says here, philosophical inquiry, moral teachings, yeah, right, symbolic interpretations, incorporating the elements of comparative religion, as we know. New Age, basically, and of course, the Kabbalah. So the Kabbalists hid inside the Scottish Rite. So this is really interesting, which was from the European Illuminati lodges. Now, I'm going to get into something which I didn't have time to get into last week, which is a paper that was produced in the year 2000. It's called Judaized Scots, Jacobite Jews, and the Development of Kabbalistic Freemasonry. It's a revision paper presented at a symposium on Western esotericism and Jewish mysticism, 18th International Congress of the International Association for the History of Religions in Durban, South Africa, August 2000. Now, this is a very well-researched paper. Okay, let's get some detail from it. The following quotations, which span 7 centuries, point to an ancient and enduring tradition that identified operative stonemasons and Scottish Freemasons as Jews. There are too many to read out here, but we'll give you a few. So it says here that Judaist Scots, Jacobite Jews, and the development of Kabbalistic Freemasonry. The paper starts with many quotes which basically describe Judaic links to Freemasonry. It says, some likewise say our Masons now do circumcision under go, for Masonry is a Jewish custom. And that is from a poem called The Freemasons by Hudibrastic, someone called Hudibrastic in 1723. I'll just give you that quote again. Some likewise say our Masons now do circumcision under go, for Masonry is a Jewish custom. So we can see that it was completely taken over in this way through the Scottish Rite. Again, a quote now from Rabbi Isaac Wise, Scottish Rite Mason. And this is from a publication called the Scottish Rite Mason, the Israelite, from a publication called the Israelite from the Scottish Rite Freemasons. So Rabbi Isaac Wise said, Masonry is a Jewish institution whose history, degrees, charges, passwords, and explanations are Jewish from the beginning to the end, with the exception of only one by degree and a few words in the obligation. The beauty and pride of Masonry is its universal character, its tendency to fraternize mankind. So that's a very interesting statement, isn't it? Because I think what he's talking about is not necessarily Judaism, but Kabbalah, which isn't recognized, of course, throughout Judaism. It's recognized in certain sects of this very large holding. It's a kind of hold-all term of Judaism. It says we can begin to understand the international emergence of higher degrees of Kabbalistic mysticism in the Ikose Masonic lodges, the Ikose, that's the word, Masonic lodges that wielded such a mysterious and powerful influence on the culture of the, in brackets, enlightened 18th and, in brackets, progressive 19th centuries. So then I decided to look at the ikose.info website, which is the Ikose is the incorporation of the Scottish Rite. And guess what their website header is at ikose.info? Order ab chaos, order from chaos. And then it quotes, behold, how good and how pleasant it is for brethren to dwell together in unity. Psalm 133:1. So again, using the Bible for their own ends. It says, for we be brethren of the rosy cross. We have the Mason word and second sight. Things for to come we can foretell, all right. Very badly right. So that was written by a Freemason. That's actually from the Muses Threnody, which was a publication by Henry Adamson in 1638. I'll read that again. For we be brethren of the rosy cross, Rosicrucians. We have the Mason word, meaning their password, and second sight. Interesting. For things for to come, we can foretell, all right. That says quite a lot, doesn't it? This is a Masonic song. It's called Ye Sons of Old Killie, and it's from the poem by Freemasonic brother Robert Burns. Within this dear mansion may wayward contention or withered envy never enter. May secrecy round be the mystical bound and brotherly love be the center. Interesting. I haven't read out the whole thing. That's just the sort of conclusion to it, which I thought was the most telling part of it. Another indication of Kabbalism on this website is this quote. And this verse came from a brass square dated 1507, which was found in the east corner of Baal's Bridge. Yes, B-A-A-L, B-A-A-L, Baal, as in Baal monarch. Baal's Bridge in Limerick Island in 1830. I will strive to live with love and care upon the level and by the square. There you go. So, these references to Kabbalah and Freemasonry coincide with the Kabbalah of the Languedoc, which dates from the 1200s onwards. So, here's a quote from the Ecosse website. Freemasonry, a definition. Freemasonry is a peculiar system of morality veiled in, wait for it, you'll never guess, allegory, and illustrated by symbols. And that is from a publication called The Craft Ritual. So, under that, on the website, it says, Audi vide tasse. Hear, see, and be silent. There you go. They're not a secret society. They're a society with secrets. It's in their own words, you see. So, now we get on to the Sinclairs of Roslin and Roslin Chapel and its importance. William St. Clair of Roslin, the 20th feudal Baron of Roslin, 1700 to 1778, was the first Grand Master Mason of the Grand Lodge of Scotland. He became the first Grand Master Mason by acclamation on St. Andrew's Day in 1736. He was initiated in Lodge Canongate, Kilwinning, on the 18th of May, and he passed on the 2nd of June 1736 and was raised. That's the third degree, where you go into the coffin and then you're reborn into the brotherhood. I think that's what we mean by that. And raised on the 3rd of November 1736. So after 3rd of November 1736, there was no going back for William St. Clair of Roslin. He was in the brotherhood for life. He was supposedly the last of a long line of hereditary Grand Masters, and surrendered his hereditary office on becoming the first elected Grand Master of the new Grand Lodge of Scotland. So they're saying he was a Grand Master by hereditary lineage. So maybe he didn't have a choice. However, it says, his ancestors were actually patrons and protectors of the Scottish stonemasons, according to the Sinclair Charters, and they were never hereditary Grand Master Masons, as the foundational myth of the Grand Lodge of Scotland suggests. So maybe they just stated that he was, and there's nothing that the Sinclairs can do about it. So because they were initiated into the Grand Lodge, they're saying, well, they came from a long line of our lineage. So they've usurped possibly the bloodline of those of Roslin Chapel, the Sinclairs of Scotland, as being some kind of predecessor and Grand Masters which predated their own lodge, therefore adding to the myth, the legend, and the allegory, which they're so fond of. So they were co-opted into the new system of Masonry by the look of it. The first Sinclair Charter, it was granted by the Masons of Scotland to William St. Clair of Roslin in 1601. Very interesting. This is all coinciding, of course, with the Rose Cross Fraternity, the Rosicrucians, whose first publication was around 1610, 1614. So the Rosicrucians would have been known within the occult system of Freemasonry way before it was announced to the public, because of course they were advertising around Antwerp. But this is really interesting. So we can see that there is a direct link to the Grand Order, the Grand Lodge of Scotland, and to this age of the Rosicrucians. It is this Masons of Scotland to William St. Clair of Roslin, 1601. Okay. It is a statement on behalf of the Scottish Rite claiming that evil deeds had been attributed to the Masons, and has given occasion to many persons to conceive evil opinions of us and our craft. and to leave off great enterprises of policy by reason of our great misbehaviour, without correction, whereby not only the committers of the faults, but also the honest men are disappointed with their craft and profit. So that's basically an admission in a way, isn't it? And it's just saying, well, some of us are quite good and there's some naughty ones. It says it's signed by William Shaw. Now that's SCHAW, William Shaw, master of the work. He was one of the initiators of the Scottish Rite of Freemasonry, according to their legends. Just as an aside here, a friend of mine who knew a bit about this sort of stuff found himself next to one of the descendants of the Sinclairs in a pub in Chelsea. And he turned round to this fella and he said, I know all about Roslin Chapel. And this fella can be quite convincing because he does know a bit. And this Sinclair ran out of the pub, left his pint, ran out of the pub. So that kind of adds up with what we've just heard, doesn't it? That maybe these people were all for Freemasonry and ended up being controlled by them. Makes absolute sense. Scottish Rite Kabbalism in the 1700s. Okay, this is again from this document, Judaized Scots, produced in the year 2000. And this quote is from Jonathan Swift, and it's a letter from the Grand Mistress of the Female Freemasons in 1724. The branch of the Lodge of Solomon's Temple, afterwards called the Lodge of St. John of Jerusalem, is, as I can easily prove, the antiest and purest now on earth. The famous old Scottish Lodge of Kilwinning, of which all the kings of Scotland have been from time to time Grand Masters, without interruption down from the days of Fergus, who was carefully instructed in all the arts and sciences, especially in the natural magic and the Kabbalistical philosophy. Interesting. So it's all coming together, isn't it? They were afterwards, it says, this is the same letter from the Grand Mistress of the Female Freemasons. It says afterwards called the Rosicrucians. There you go. That's exactly what we were just preempting. And it's all come together with this quote. Speaking of the Kabbalah, as Masonry was called in those days. So that's from 1724. So they're saying afterwards called the Rosicrucians. The Freemasons afterwards called the Rosicrucian because with their natural magic and Kabbalistic philosophy. Speaking of the Kabbalah, as Masonry was called in those days. So Kabbalah is Freemasonry, according to the Scottish Rite. There you go. It's all come together. These verses are from a brass square dated 1507. Right. Hang on a minute. We're getting onto something else here. Let me make sure I've got the right thing. Right. Hang on a minute. Let's just get back to that. Right. Yes. Right. Just I want to correct something. It's just my notes here. I need to correct something. When we talked about Ballsbridge in Limerick, Ireland, those verses date from 1507. I don't know whether I mentioned that, but that was called Ballsbridge in Limerick, Ireland. And this was a brass plate that was found in 1830. And the verse that I quoted earlier on was actually dated 1507. Well, that puts another perspective on it altogether, doesn't it? So we're now getting closer and closer to the time of the Kabbalist and the Languedoc. Because if we're told that the Scottish Rite, and of course the Grand Lodge was only incorporated in 1717, but we're also told that King Athelstan started the real Freemasonry in the early 900s. And it starts to make sense that what we've just been quoting from this document of the Judaized Scots into Freemasonry, it really makes sense, doesn't it? That there was a Kabbalistic influence from the very start. So it carries on. Stuart kings, as agents of scientific enlightenment and religious toleration, utilized Freemasonry as a vehicle for their Solomonic culture and dynastic preservation. Interesting, isn't it? Because if we go to the works of Comyns Beaumont, the whole thing as Scotland and Edinburgh as Jerusalem starts to come together with Freemasonry. Why is it called the Scottish Rite? because of the importance of Scotland and the infiltration of Scotland with Kabbalah. It carries on. The identification of Scots with Jews emerged most strikingly in the 14th century when Scotland fought for national survival against her southern enemies in England. Well, I would say it's actually older. The Kabbalistic work, the Sefer Yetzirah, has a Masonic function, for the letters and words serve as building blocks. Now, this is where it ties again to the Scottish Rite. It says letters are regarded as stones, as full-fledged entities, as components intended to build up an edifice of words, to serve as a temple for God and a place for encountering him for the mystic. Completely Kabbalistic. That's a completely Kabbalistic statement. Goes into the gematria, the letters, the 22 letters of the Hebrew or Aramaic language as it became. It says, after the temple was destroyed, man is supposed to rebuild the temple in his ritual use of language, Kabbalah, in a nutshell. It says the Masonic aspects of the divine and human activity reveal a hidden and mighty dimension of the Hebrew letters. Well, it's actually Aramaic, which enable operations that can bridge the gap between the human or the material and the divine. Here we have to look at the Scottish Hebrews. Go and have a look at the Treaty of Arbroath. Go and have a look on a map of Scotland and have a look at a place called Sukkoth, which means Sabbath, which I believe is where Hebrews came in to Scotland. And maybe they came in from another part of Scotland. Have a look at that. Sukkoth, meaning Sabbath. Succoth. Did a bit of a deep dive on this about 10 years ago. But let's carry on. It says, yes, the Hebrew letters have numerical correspondences, and the complex linguistic numerical computations of the Sefer Yetzirah become relevant to the mathematical skills of architects and masons. So here we have, it's totally Kabbalistic. After the temple was destroyed, man is supposed to rebuild the temple in his ritual use of language. That's where it all came from. It's a completely Kabbalistic system. The Scottish Rite, the rebuilding of the temple. And even I used to do some social clubs and places that had Masonic meetings, and you'd find all this crap in the dressing rooms. And I thought, what are all those building blocks? And it was these Freemasons going there, and they rebuild Solomon's temple like a sort of game of Jenga. You know, they go and build it out a bit like, it's like baby stuff. They're building this temple out of these little wooden bricks, followed by an almighty piss up as usual, I suppose. Yes, the capacity to visualize the architectural and pictorial expression of the complex mathematical and geometrical speculation became associated with the practical expertise of the architect and master mason. The 22 letters are the foundation. He engraved them, he hewed them out, and he formed them, everything that is formed. That's like saying Hebrew is the word of God. Well, no, actually, it would have been Aramaic, because the Hebrew and the Aramaic are very related, because Hebrew actually went into Aramaic. So the Hebrew letters became the Aramaic ones. Okay, let's carry on with their waffle. In the schools of Merkabah mysticism, Jewish adepts increasingly portrayed Solomon as an architectural magus, a magician, and his master mason Bezalel, different. I was thinking of Azazel. This is Bezalel, as a craftsman magus, initiated into the secrets of the Sefer Yetzirah, which is one of the main Kabbalistic works, along with the Zohar, usurping God's reality into their cult of God-man manifestation. That's what this is all about. It says from the 9th through the 12th centuries, the esoteric traditions of Jewish and Muslim mystical fraternities gradually penetrated Christian Europe in a mixed Judeo-Arabic form. So here we have Jacob Frank, Sabbatai Zevi, and the Kabbalah all coming together. It says, when Christian scholars tried to gain access to the, in inverted commas, lost mathematical and scientific works of the Greeks and Romans, they often relied upon Hebrew translators of Arabic versions, which included Jewish and Muslim mystical elaborations. This is where it ties in to people then being involved in Islam and going to Arabia, as of course did Father R.C. of the very mystical and allegorical Rosicrucians. He went to fairs in Morocco and he travelled through the Arab lands and he was trying to preach this new system, which was Kabbalistic, and they had their own system. All starts to add up when you read between the lines, which you have to do with some of this stuff. It says, because Orthodox officials of all three religions tended to scorn the study of mathematics and natural science as leading to forbidden magic and heresy, it's through the Catholic Church, of course, the building guilds for whom such study was necessary to their craft technology strengthened their traditions of oath-bound secrecy. There you go. Christian student of this, it's called Avis Bronist synthesis, was a man called Michael Scott, 1217 to 1240, who left his native Scotland to study with Jews and Arabs in Toledo, Spain, which is, of course, where the Sephardic Jews of the Kabbalah were in the 1200s. So there you have a direct connection where he incorporated the number symbolism of the Sefer Yetzirah into his mathematical, astronomical and linguistic theories. Moving to Sicily, Scott worked with the Jewish savant Jacob ben Anatoli on Latin translations of Aristotle, Maimonides, and other non-Christian philosophers. Newman, who's the writer, characterizes the friendship between Scott and Anatoli as one of the most significant in medieval thought. Fascinated by Solomonic traditions, Scott gained access to Jewish and Arabic mystical works on mathematics, magic, and alchemy. So here we have it, 1217 till 1240 was when this was happening, which ties directly into the time of the Kabbalists, Moses de Leon, the Zohar, the Languedoc, Spain, all coming together here with this Christian student. And of course, he wasn't the only one. So the Christians were getting infiltrated by Kabbalah at the same time as Kabbalah was being created in the overheated minds of the Kabbalists before, obviously, the later self-proclaimed messiahs. And remember that they've always been self-proclaimed messiahs in Kabbalah. After consulting with the Grand Master of the Templars, interesting, the heterodox Emperor Frederick II asked Scott to accompany him to Jerusalem. Where do they mean by that? Well, maybe they mean that place in the Middle East, but maybe they're actually referring to the place in Edinburgh. It says, where he won the peaceful surrender of the city by promising religious toleration to the Jewish and Muslim inhabitants. Scott made notes on his observations in Palestine, and when he returned to Scotland circa 1230, this is right in the middle of the Kabbalistic era, he brought with him a unique knowledge of Jewish, Muslim, and Crusader law. So here we have the crossover with the Templars into Kabbalah. In the 19th century, we're going to jump forward now because I'm taking notes from this document, when Sir Walter Scott, an active Freemason, described someone known as Old Michael as a Scottish patriot, a Kabbalistic magician and infernal architect, order out of chaos, he drew on earlier fraternal law in Spain. The Templars employed Jewish surveyors and geometricians such as Abraham Bar Hevia and the Cavaliera family. They were heavily Kabbalistic, who were familiar with Solomonic architectural mysticism. In order to attract donations for their architectural projects, the Knights Templar publicized throughout Europe the immense resources that they poured into the construction and maintenance of fortresses. This is interesting because the Knights Templar did have a massive building program. Places in Portugal are amazing. And of course, we see it all across Europe. Detailed accounts of the building of the great castle pilgrim at Acre, where, of course, they, I think, lost the battle with the Muslims, were sent home and published. And the Templar as architect in stone became a fixture in the popular imagination. So here we get the whole PR thing coming out of the Templars, including their hero knight, King Arthur, which went into the Mabinogion and the myths of the 1400s in the age of chivalry later on. So, like everything else, their PR output included the later knight hero, King Arthur. So, the poor knights of the Money Temple. That's what we're going to get onto next. Yeah, just I'm having a trouble with this. It jumps up and down for some reason. I don't know why. However, just have a swig of this. So now let's get on to the poor knights of the Money Temple. In England especially, the Templars used architecture as a visual aid to impress the populace by their direct connection with Jerusalem, which they expressed in the round church built in London in 1185. That's the Templar church in the city of London. Not that impressive, but it's round and it's got a dome. I've been inside it. But this is interesting because the Templars using architecture as a visual aid. I remember I did a show years ago, and this is, I think, how this stuff gets into legend. They were saying that these Templar constructed churches were very good to have out-of-body experiences and stuff like that. I would say there was nothing esoteric or mystical about the Knights Templar. That was the cover story. They were, of course, the first moneylenders and the transporters of gold and the producers of promissory notes. The poor knights of the Money Temple, not the poor knights of Christ. And of course, they became incorporated into the Knights Hospitaller or the Knights of St. John of Jerusalem. So many different titles they had. But the poor knights of Christ is probably the most ironic. In England especially, the Templars used architecture as a visual aid. The Templar Church in the City of London is actually nothing very special and cannot compare with the age of cathedral building. That's very, very important. When we look at the cathedrals across Europe, they are in another league to the building of the Templars. The interesting part are the Templar graves around the church, actually. If you ever want to go to the City of London, have a look, because you'll see the graves of Templars, and they always have their right foot forward for initiation, even on the graves. So they've got these little statues of the Templars with their right foot forward. Very, very interesting. But it's to me anyway. You might find it quite boring. But it's actually interesting now, Nick. It's very near Lincoln's Inn Fields, and City of London, great day out. Yeah, you'll never see enough there. There's places in the City of London I've never been, and I've walked around it so many times. The design was based on the Dome of the Rock. This is the Templar Church in the City of London, which was at the time a mosque, which they believed was the plan of the original Solomon's Temple, which of course they do to this day, as I think is a major distraction. After the construction of their Jewish church, in inverted commas, the Templars continued to have a significant influence on operative masonry in England. In 1271, the future Edward I visited Palestine, where he collaborated with the Grand Master of the Templars. On his return, he determined to build Templar-style castles as part of his secret plan to first fortify London and then conquer Wales and Scotland, which of course he did. He ordered his keeper of the works to manage, in inverted commas, the craftsmen and to extract money from the reluctant Jews to help finance his architectural projects. And like his father, Edward made the Templars guardians of the royal treasury, and they also held the tallage of London and of the Jews. Thus, the knights were involved in these Masonic Jewish negotiations. Closely affiliated with the Templars was the Crusading Order of St. Thomas of Acre, and Edward I employed so-called Brother John of St. Thomas as master of the king's works, an operative mason who worked with the keeper of works and the master mason. John was given responsibility over the Tower, Westminster Palace, and the King's Mews. Acre had served as a centre for Christian and Jewish pilgrims to Jerusalem, and it gave refuge to hundreds of rabbis from England and France. The city had a flourishing artisan culture, and it attracted Jewish scholars and theosophers such as the great Kabbalist, the one we mentioned earlier, Abraham Abulafia, 1240 to 1292, who merged the meditation techniques of the Sefer Yetzirah with those of Sufi and Christian mystics to develop a complex methodological technique for achieving a visionary marriage with the Shekinah, an experience of psychoerotic ecstasy. Again, I'm quoting from this paper, Judaized Scots, year 2000. Abulafia reached out to Christians and even hoped to convert the Pope to his Kabbalistic theosophy. This again ties in to last week's show, where the later followers of Jacob Frank, the Kabbalists of modern-day Ukraine, were actually hiding inside the Catholic Church as Catholics. And of course, they went to Ireland. So we have the Kabbalists going to Ireland into the priest, I think it's Jacob Marano Jew, who was actually descendant of Sabbatai Zevi, of Jacob Frank. And the descendants of Zevi ended up in Ireland also, through his daughter, Ava Frank, who also proclaimed herself to be the Messiah. Can you see how it's gone wrong so far? So Abulafia reached out to Christians and even hoped to convert the Pope. His efforts resulted in the apostasy to Christianity of some of his followers. So what they mean by that is that they started hiding within Catholicism. And of course, the Catholic Church wanted them because they had a middleman system, the same as the Catholic Church. In other words, you had to go through the tree of life to attain any kind of higher vision. Worked perfectly with the gatekeepers of the Vatican, later Vatican, as it was before 1829, the Catholic or Universal Church. Remember, there is one universal church outside of which there is absolutely no way of reaching a higher power. So you have to have the middleman. It says it is possible that Abulufian interpretations of the Sefer Yetzirah influenced the architectural mysticism of Christian as well as Jewish Masons. There you have it, bringing it all together, the Kabbalah into the Scottish Rite and later into Theosophy through people like MacGregor Mathers, who wrote his own book on Christian Kabbalah, and Johannes Rochlin, who wrote about Christian Kabbalah. The whole influence is there now. It all comes together with our previous shows. It says, when Sir William Wallace raised a popular rebellion against the occupying English forces, he was aided by the prophecies of the second-sighted bard Thomas the Rhymer, whose political and military precognition became part of Scottish patriotic and Masonic legend. Rhymer's prophecies were subsequently embellished in Solomonic imagery, which portrayed future Scottish kings marching into Jerusalem. And where's Jerusalem? Edinburgh. This development was possibly associated with the increasingly public identification of nationalistic Scots with the Jews of the Old Testament. All comes together with Beaumont's stuff as well. An identification that many believed was reinforced by blood relation. From the 11th century, Scots prided themselves on their racial descent from the ancient Egyptians of Mosaic times. So, the shows that we've been doing on Shattered Isles also tie directly into this. As I'm doing these shows, even more things are linking together, which is why I like doing them live, because it makes it all start to fire off. Fantastic stuff. So, it says here, after Moses fell into disfavor, Gathelus became leader of the Egyptian army and married the Pharaoh's daughter, Scota. However, Moses was friendly with the young couple and he gave them the Stone of Destiny, or Jacob's Pillow, which they carried to Spain, Ireland, and finally to Scotland, where it became the coronation stone for the Scottish kings. The stone's connection with Jacob's vision fed into Scottish traditions of second sight and bardic prophecy. I would suggest that Scotland was the centre of all this stuff. And that is why the Stone of Scone was so important to the kings of Britain. It is in Westminster Abbey, of course, and every monarch has to be crowned upon the stone, or what may now be the fake Stone of Scone, which is actually and has actually been defined as a Roman doorstep. So the original Stone of Scone may well have existed, but it's certainly, probably, definitely maybe, or probably not the one in Westminster Abbey today. By the early 12th century, the Scottish King David I, a close friend of the first Grand Master of the Templars and major employer of the Knights Templar, was portrayed by an English chronicler as a descendant of the biblical David. Here we go. How many times has this been used to justify people taking over? Most recently, of course, the House of Hanover, masquerading as the House of Windsor, Saxe-Coburg-Gothas. It says, whose royal image as patron of temple church building he reflected. Biblical David, of course. Elaborating on these Jewish roots, Scottish writers would proclaim David the first descent from Japhet, the son of Noah. Okay, so we're talking here about the real versus the fake, the fantasy versus the true reality. So nothing, in conclusion, in the Jerusalem of today can be related to the early Jewish era, and its oldest archaeological remains are only late Roman. Nothing in the group's ruins, it says, hang on, keeps jumping about this, don't know why. Nothing in the groups of ruins at Petra, Sebaste, Baalbek, Palmyra, or Damascus, or among the stone cities of Haram is pre-Roman. Now, that is a quote from The Great Deception by William Comyns Beaumont, that nothing in the Jerusalem of today can be related to the early Jewish era. Its oldest archaeological remains are only late Roman. Of course, this was repeated in the riddle of prehistoric Britain as well. And this is where it starts to get interesting. So we've put together the earliest migration of Freemasonry through King Athelstan into Britain, into Scotland, the Kabbalistic influence from the Languedoc, the parallels in the time spectrum going into not only the Templars, but the Rose Cross Freemasonry, the Scottish Rite. All of this goes into Kabbalah and the influence of Sabbatai Zevi and Jacob Frank, who were just the most recent of these messiahs. And just to reiterate, the subversion of minds into the meaningless through fake mystery has hooked, of course, millions, and initiates of this are the useful idiots who are necessary to carry on what they call the great work. In other words, useful idiots and dupes for life through a cult. And who really needs that? This ties in to the work that we've been doing in the shows, which is all about elevating yourself above cult behavior, the perfected mind field, which is something which is available to everybody, but takes real work and real self-realization that what we gain inspiration from is outside of us, and it is from God. It is from a higher power. We cannot force ourselves into seeing the higher power through a ritualistic system based on stupidity and mind control. So I hope that put a few things together. It certainly did for me, and that's why I enjoy doing these live shows, because they make my brain fire as I'm putting all this stuff together. So do remember, we're here every Monday, 8 p.m. GMT, and do check out the website, windowsontheworld.net. You can join our Discord server. All the links are on the homepage of the website, and do support the show if you like what we do. So thanks a lot, everybody. I'll get off now and look at some of the comments.